In the early summer of 1940, Europe seemed to belong entirely to Adolf Hitler. German armies had moved with terrifying speed, smashing through Poland, overrunning Denmark and Norway, and then sweeping west with a force and coordination the world had never seen. The Netherlands collapsed in days. Belgium followed. France, the great military power of the First World War, fell in just 6 weeks. German soldiers marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe, and Nazi banners flew from buildings that had once symbolized European resistance. Across the English Channel, Britain stood alone. To many in Berlin, the situation appeared hopeless for the British. Their army had been driven off the continent, abandoning tanks, guns, and equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk. Their allies were defeated or neutral. Their empire was vast, but their homeland was exposed. Only a narrow stretch of water separated Germany from final victory in the West. The question that seemed obvious to the world was simple. When would Germany invade Britain? Yet beneath the surface of German triumph lay a dangerous illusion. The same speed and confidence that had brought victory on land now hid deep weaknesses, strategic, logistical, and psychological, that would ultimately prevent Germany from ever setting foot on British soil in force. The failure to invade Britain was not the result of British strength alone, but of German hesitation, misjudgment, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of war Britain was prepared to fight. Adolf Hitler himself never truly wanted to invade Britain. His hatred was reserved for the East, for Bolshevism and the Soviet Union. Britain, in his mind, was a fellow empire, a racial and cultural cousin that should logically accept German dominance on the continent and continue ruling its overseas possessions. He admired the British Empire, even as he fought it. More than once he expressed the belief that Britain would eventually see reason and seek peace. This belief shaped everything. After the fall of France, Hitler did not immediately order preparations for an invasion. Instead, he paused. He made speeches hinting at reconciliation. He allowed intermediaries to float peace feelers. He convinced himself that Britain's leaders, faced with isolation and ruin, would negotiate. But Britain had chosen a different man to lead them. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, rejected compromise entirely. To him, surrender would mean not survival, but national extinction. While Hitler hesitated, Britain prepared. Operation Sealion, the German plan to invade Britain, was born not from confidence, but from frustration. Only when it became clear that Britain would not negotiate did Hitler reluctantly authorize invasion planning in July 1940. Even then, Sealion was less a concrete military plan than a conditional threat. It depended on one critical requirement. Germany must first gain total control of the air. Without air superiority, an invasion was impossible. The German High Command understood this, but it was deeply divided. The army wanted a massive landing along a wide stretch of England's southern coast, believing that overwhelming force would crush resistance quickly. The Navy, painfully aware of its weakness, argued for a much narrower landing closer to France, minimizing exposure to the Royal Navy. The Air Force, under Hermann Göring, insisted that the RAF could be destroyed quickly, making all other concerns irrelevant. These disagreements were never fully resolved. Germany's navy was the greatest obstacle to invasion from the very beginning. The Kriegsmarine had been designed for commerce raiding, not for challenging the world's most powerful fleet. Britain's Royal Navy was vast, experienced, and globally deployed. Even after losses earlier in the war, it remained overwhelmingly superior to Germany's surface fleet. German naval commanders warned that once an invasion fleet entered the Channel, the Royal Navy would attack relentlessly. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers could tear apart slow-moving transports long before German forces could establish a secure foothold. German air power, they argued, could not fully protect ships at sea, especially at night or in poor weather. To make matters worse, Germany lacked proper invasion vessels. There were no specialized landing craft like those the Allies would later use on D-Day. Instead, the plan relied on thousands of converted river barges, flat-bottomed vessels designed for calm inland waters, not the unpredictable seas of the Channel. These barges were slow, hard to maneuver, and dangerously unstable in rough weather. Many could not even carry heavy equipment without risk of capsizing. German officers privately feared that Sealion would become a floating disaster. Still, preparations continued, driven by political pressure rather than military confidence. Barges were gathered from across occupied Europe. Troops trained for amphibious landings they barely understood. On paper, the invasion force looked massive. In reality, it was fragile, exposed, and dependent on perfect conditions. Everything depended on the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain began not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual escalation. In July 1940, German aircraft began attacking British shipping in the Channel and probing coastal defenses. These early engagements were meant to draw out British fighters and test their strength. German pilots were experienced veterans of Poland, France, and Spain. They believed the RAF would be crushed just as easily. They were wrong. Britain possessed a hidden advantage that Germany never fully grasped: an integrated air defense system unlike anything in the world. Along the British coast stood radar stations that could detect incoming aircraft while they were still forming over France. This information flowed into command centers that tracked raids in real time and directed fighter squadrons with remarkable efficiency. Instead of patrolling aimlessly, RAF pilots were scrambled only when needed, conserving fuel and strength. They fought over their own territory, allowing damaged planes and pilots to return quickly to battle. Downed German airmen, by contrast, became prisoners, or were lost forever in the sea. The Luftwaffe underestimated radar. They attacked a few stations early on, damaging some, but never committed to destroying the system completely. Repairs were rapid. The radar network remained intact, quietly shaping every battle that followed. As German attacks intensified, the limitations of their aircraft became painfully clear. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's best fighter, was fast and deadly, but it had a short operational range. Flying from bases in France, pilots had only minutes of combat time over southern England before fuel forced them to turn back. British fighters, flying from nearby airfields, could stay longer and re-engage repeatedly. German bombers suffered heavily. Without continuous fighter escort, they became vulnerable to interception. Losses mounted. Experienced crews were killed faster than they could be replaced. Yet perhaps the greatest German failure was not technical, but strategic. The Luftwaffe never settled on a clear objective. At first it targeted shipping and coastal installations. Then it shifted to attacking RAF airfields and fighter bases, coming dangerously close to breaking Britain's air defenses. Fighter Command was under enormous strain. Pilots were exhausted. Aircraft losses were severe. Another few weeks of sustained pressure might have pushed the RAF to collapse. Then, abruptly, the focus changed. In September 1940, German bombers began attacking London and other major cities in massive daylight raids. The Blitz had begun. The reasons for this shift were complex: retaliation for British bombing of Berlin, political pressure, Göring's overconfidence, but the result was decisive. The pressure on RAF airfields eased. Runways were repaired. Squadrons reorganized. Fighter Command survived. Germany had blinked. As bombs fell on London, the British people did not break. They endured. Night after night, fires burned and buildings collapsed. But morale held. Instead of forcing surrender, the bombing hardened British resolve. The invasion that was supposed to follow never came. By the autumn of 1940, Operation Sealion was effectively dead. Air superiority had not been achieved. The Royal Navy remained a lethal threat. Weather conditions worsened, and Hitler's attention began to drift eastward toward a far greater gamble. The narrow sea had done its work. Germany had failed to invade Britain not because it lacked power, but because it lacked clarity, preparation, and understanding. What seemed at first like an inevitable conquest had been undone by hesitation, miscalculation, and an enemy that refused to behave as expected. And as Britain stood unbroken, the war entered a new and far deadlier phase, one that would ultimately consume the Third Reich itself. By October 1940, the great invasion that the world had expected simply faded into silence. Along the French and Belgian coasts, thousands of German troops waited in camps near the water. Barges lay moored in harbors and rivers, their decks crowded with equipment that would never be used. Training exercises slowed, then stopped. Quiet orders were issued. Operation Sealion was postponed, first indefinitely, then permanently. Germany would never invade Britain. The reasons were now impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Despite heavy losses and exhaustion, Fighter Command still controlled the skies over southern England. British radar continued to function. Aircraft production actually increased during the battle, replacing losses faster than Germany could. Most critically, Britain retained the ability to contest the air above the Channel. Without air superiority, any invasion force would be slaughtered. The German Navy knew it. The Army knew it. Even Hitler, reluctant as he was to admit failure, understood the reality. The Royal Navy remained undefeated and immensely dangerous. In daylight, British warships could be attacked by German aircraft, but not destroyed in sufficient numbers. At night, when the Luftwaffe was far less effective, the Royal Navy would have free rein to annihilate invasion convoys. German planners ran simulations and war games. The results were grim. Even under optimistic assumptions, invasion forces would struggle to land heavy equipment. Supply lines would be fragile. A single storm could scatter barges and sink hundreds. British counterattacks, supported by naval gunfire, could push German troops back into the sea within days. Sealion was not delayed because Germany lacked courage. It was delayed because it lacked feasibility. As autumn storms swept across the Channel, the invasion window closed. Weather conditions suitable for amphibious landings were limited, and by late October, they were gone. Winter would make large-scale crossings impossible. Any invasion would have to wait until 1941. But by then, Hitler's focus had already shifted. For Adolf Hitler, Britain's refusal to surrender was an irritation, not a fatal threat. He believed that as long as Britain remained isolated, it could be dealt with later. His true ideological enemy lay to the east. The Soviet Union, with its vast territory and enormous resources, loomed large in his thinking. He convinced himself that destroying the USSR would end the war entirely. Britain, he believed, would collapse once it lost hope of a powerful ally. This belief would become Germany's greatest mistake. In December 1940, Hitler issued Directive No. 21, the order to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Sealion was quietly shelved. Resources were redirected. Aircraft, tanks, and troops that might have been used against Britain were now earmarked for the Eastern Front. Britain survived not because Germany chose peace, but because Germany chose another war. Meanwhile, Britain used its survival to transform itself from a battered defender into a growing threat. The failure of invasion was more than a military outcome. It was a psychological turning point. Britain had stood alone and endured. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the first time, Nazi Germany had been stopped. This mattered far beyond Britain's shores. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements drew hope from Britain's survival. Across the Atlantic, American public opinion slowly shifted. The idea that Germany could be defeated no longer seemed impossible. Britain became an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a base from which the war against Nazi Germany would eventually be taken back to the continent. The reasons Germany failed to invade Britain were deeply interconnected. At the core was a fundamental mismatch between German capabilities and the task at hand. Germany excelled at land warfare. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, coordination, and shock. Amphibious invasion required patience, naval strength, logistical depth, and joint planning, qualities Germany had never needed before and never fully developed. The Kriegsmarine was simply not built for the job. Even if the Luftwaffe had gained temporary air superiority, the Navy lacked the escorts and transport vessels to sustain an invasion. Britain's ability to operate at night, to deploy submarines and destroyers, and to concentrate forces rapidly meant that any German landing would face relentless pressure. Germany's industrial priorities also played a role. Hitler favored tanks and aircraft over ships. Large-scale naval construction had begun too late and progressed too slowly. By 1940, Britain had decades of naval experience and infrastructure behind it. Germany did not. Then there was the issue of leadership and command. The German armed forces were powerful, but fragmented. The Army, Navy, and Air Force competed rather than cooperated. There was no unified command structure for joint operations. Göring promised results he could not deliver. Naval warnings were ignored or minimized. Strategic decisions were driven by Hitler's instincts rather than by realistic assessments. Britain, by contrast, benefited from defensive unity. The RAF, Royal Navy, and Army operated within a coherent national strategy. Survival. Radar, intelligence, aircraft production, and civil defense all worked toward the same goal. Even mistakes were corrected quickly because defeat was not an option. Perhaps the most underestimated factor was British morale. German strategy assumed that bombing would break civilian will. It had worked elsewhere. Cities in Poland, the Netherlands, and France had fallen under air attack. But Britain responded differently. The Blitz did not cause surrender. It caused defiance. Underground shelters filled each night. Firefighters battled flames amid falling bombs. Normal life continued as best it could. Churchill's speeches mattered, but so did something deeper, a shared understanding that Britain was fighting for its existence. There was no expectation of rescue, no illusion of quick victory. Endurance itself became a weapon. Germany never found an answer to that. By 1941, the moment had passed. Britain was growing stronger, not weaker. American aid flowed through Lend-Lease. New aircraft entered service. Coastal defenses expanded. The longer Germany waited, the harder invasion became. And then came Barbarossa. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the war transformed overnight. The scale of fighting in the East dwarfed everything that had come before. Millions of men clashed across vast distances. Germany committed the bulk of its military power to a struggle it believed would be quick and decisive. It was not. As German forces became bogged down in Russia, Britain's importance increased. British bombers struck German cities. British intelligence cracked German codes. British forces fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually in Italy. The island that Germany had failed to invade became the launching point for its eventual defeat. In retrospect, the failure to invade Britain was not a single missed opportunity, but a moment when Germany's limitations were exposed. Hitler's confidence in willpower over logistics, ideology over geography, and speed over sustainability led him into choices he could not undo. Britain's survival ensured that Germany would always face a war on multiple fronts. It guaranteed that the United States would have a base in Europe. It preserved a free government that could coordinate resistance and plan a return to the continent. When Allied troops finally landed in Normandy in June 1944, they crossed the same waters Germany had once hoped to dominate. But they did so with overwhelming naval power, total air superiority, and years of preparation, everything Germany had lacked in 1940. The narrow sea that Germany could not cross became the pathway of its destruction. Germany failed to invade Britain because it underestimated its enemy, overestimated its own capabilities, and chose ideology over reality. The Channel was not just a physical barrier, it was a strategic mirror, reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of both nations. Britain endured, Germany moved on. And in that moment of hesitation, the course of World War II was forever changed.